So if you have a suggestion for a study, please let me know, or text me, email me, whatever. We've got this week and next week, and then we're done with this. So
Anything but Ecclesiastes.
His favorite
I love
book.
Ecclesiastes. It's the best book, outside of Job. So, and I don't know, just to reiterate, if you wasn't here last week, we had a vote. We're calling ourselves the Truth Seekers now. So that was the result of the vote. Thank you all for participating in that, and we'll get that announced and all that stuff. Well, so this week we are on session, I think it's 4. Mm-hmm. This is Jacob. So one talks about Jacob in the session, and there's a lot here, and I hope everybody was able to watch the session and read through at least the parts in Genesis that talk about Jacob. He says specifically in 32, but I think the story of Jacob goes from like 28 through, I want to say like 38 or 40. I mean, Jacob starts to take up a larger chunk comparatively, and you have that whole birthright story with Esau.
28 to 30.
So, and we could talk about some of that, because that story in particular to me has always been a little fascinating, because I think there's a lot there to study. But like I always start with, is there anything in particular that really stuck out at you in this study? Anything in particular that really just kind of, wow.
Well, I was just concerned why his biological son didn't get chosen to be blessed other than the other one, the oldest one.
Esau?
Yeah.
Well, they were both biological sons.
Well, I mean, they had different mothers.
They were twins. They came out of the same womb.
Oh, they were twins.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, okay.
I think you're thinking about Joseph's children.
I think I
Yeah,
was.
now that,
Okay.
yeah.
That might be who I'm thinking about. Okay.
Yeah, so Esau and Jacob came out. They were twins.
Okay.
And you have that whole, Esau came out first, but Jacob was holding on to the heel.
Yeah.
And
okay. Yeah.
there's a whole lot of foreshadowing there, right? But yeah, it's a fascinating story, and it's a little weird, right? Like, why is this included in the Bible? Like, these weird details, you know?
He had so many, Leah and Rachel, and then he had both of them handmaids, and he had kids.
Yeah, I hope you were taking notes.
12 boys.
Hope you were taking notes,
He had
because
12 tribes named after him.
there's a whole lot going on there. I was trying to take notes, and I was like, I
He
can't
herded
keep track.
sheep during the day and all this. I was like, man, how did you live all them years?
Well, he says he lived to 150, though, so, or 149. He lived a lot longer than what we did. You know, so maybe that's a blessing. Maybe that's a curse. I don't know.
Speaking of blessings, that was one thing I noticed was not there, because his mother had Jacob go in to trick his father to give him the blessing as well as the birthright.
Yeah, isn't that funny? Anon kind of skipped over that. But Anon's trying to focus on particular pieces. I think overall what Anon was trying to say is true, but he did skip over that. Yeah, that whole blessing thing, which was a little strange. So if we review the story, let's just go over a high level so we're all on the same page. Esau and Jacob, twins that came out. Esau was like the big, manly, hairy guy. Jacob was
Soft skin.
mama's boy, right? If I have no better terminology.
That's another thing I always pulled me, because they're twins. You know, usually twins are a lot alike.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they were, just polar opposites.
Yeah, if we could say Jacob was the weaker one, right? That would also be. But he tended the flocks, which is necessary. Esau, for some reason, just despised his birthright. He just didn't care about it. And Jacob wanted it, right? Birthright is that the firstborn son, right? They get like double portion of the inheritance. They're, very important. Whereas, everybody else is later. Still important. You still love your kids, but not as much as the firstborn.
My last study on Jacob and Esau, Jacob received something from Isaac that was very important. It was handed down from Isaac's father, Abraham, and to him was a staff that Jacob carried. And in that staff, when he carried that stick, when the shepherds run up in encounters or anything,
Okay.
You just, how many times you have to sit down there when you wouldn't do anything, looking at your sheet, you had to carve your little lesson that you learned, or whatever you encountered on that staff.
I hadn't heard that.
I didn't know
Points
that.
out,
Yeah.
and he carried it throughout his life. He even stood on the mountain with it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, there's a lot there, and you know, even if you read the story, it kind of skips over certain pieces.
With David and all of it,
Yeah.
and how important that one staff was, and they used it a lot of times to shake bushes and things to keep the serpents from coming out from other
Yeah.
different ways to get, you know.
Yeah. Staff was a practical tool.
Yeah, it's a practical tool, but it also has some kind of sentimental value
Yeah.
to it to a long run.
So Esau despised his birthright, whatever, and Jacob wanted it. And so Jacob, at first, gets Esau to sell him his birthright over what's described as some type of like soup or, my bad.
Like a bean soup.
Yeah, like a bean soup or something. And so Esau sells Jacob his birthright, which is that double portion of inheritance and stuff. A little bit further on, there is, as Isaac, their father, is getting up in age, right? He's about to pass away. There's a blessing then that he's going to bestow upon his eldest, Esau, and Jacob wants the blessing too. Now, from what I could read and from my studies, is that the blessing belongs with the birthright. So you have this story in here about the mother getting Jacob to go and trick his father to receive the blessing. And he does, and of course Esau is not happy about this, and Jacob flees. And this is where, you know, he runs off and he meets Rachel, his wife, and then you have the story of he would love to marry Rachel, ask his father, or her father, and the father says, well, you have to work for me 7 years, and then I'll give it. But Rachel has an older sister named Leah, who's described as sleepy eyes, I think. Not pretty, okay? Rachel's described as very beautiful. Leah, no, not so much. So he goes into the marriage, and the father has given Leah to Jacob as his wife, and Jacob has been tricked. And Jacob says, hey, the deal was for Rachel. And the father's like, well, we don't give the younger sister before the older sister's been married off. You work for me another 7 years, you can have Rachel. And he does, and he gets Rachel. And then through all this time, right, Jacob and Rachel try to have children, says she can't. Leah starts having children, and then you have this, then Rachel is able to have children, and then the handmaidens start having children, and, you know, it's this fight between Leah and Rachel about, you know, who's the better wife, or, you know, the blessings or whatever, and they get through that, and then Jacob's working on the flocks, and he's working for the father, and he's been able to take the father's little flocks and, you know, a lot of flocks. Well, this starts causing contention between him and the father. And so they finally, Jacob's like, hey, this is a dangerous situation. I got to get out of here. And they take off. And then we have the story where they're on the run or moving. And Jacob has that dream at Bethel, right? Bethel. And anyway, he goes on from there, reunited with Esau. You know, tries to butter him up, and they're reconciled, and then Jacob moves on to his own land and is able to be prosperous.
Rachel took the idols that belonged to her father, and there was a curse on that.
I'm hitting the highlights, right? Yes, there's a lot there, right? There's idolatry there. I mean, you have to read it. We're not going to study each particular lesson there. There's a lot there, Now, that's the overview. Now, Anon is picking and choosing, right? Just like we are today. What can we learn from Jacob? Because he tricked his brother. He then went on to pursue, he thought that's what he wanted, and then that backfired on him. He went on to pursue romance with Rachel, and that cost him 14 years of his life. Then he goes on to pursue wealth, right? And he's good at it, but then that starts causing contention, right? And isn't that how wealth works, right? It's crazy, but it's not an uncommon story. So what can we learn from this? Anon says some things in here, but what were your own takeaways? Yes.
The biggest thing was Jacob had faith. Which they said Esau had little. Jacob always went to faith to God for whatever he wanted to do, but he also put that faith to action.
There's a lot. Yeah, we're going to come around to this, but yeah, that's what we're going to get to is like we've gone through 3 now. Abraham, Isaac, now Jacob, right? They're all flawed people, right? If my brother tricked me, not that we have birthrights nowadays, we don't really have that in our culture, right? But still the firstborn son is fairly important, or to some people, right? We've kind of gone away from that. What does all this mean to us? And what are some of our takeaways that we have of it today? Like, what is the meaning that it was trying to convey then? And then what is the spiritual truth that is eternal that we can take away today? There's a lot going on here. So there's 3 lessons, and either you can say what Anon said, or we can talk about your own lessons. I mean, we're all here to learn from each other.
Yeah, I think one of them is you learn respect, family respect.
Family respect. How much of this drama could have been avoided had we just, communicated and, talked about things rather than tricking and
All of it.
right?
Deceiving.
We could have cut like
Yeah,
20 chapters out of the Bible if we just communicated, right?
yeah.
And it cost him. I mean, it cost Jacob 14 years, and then he worked for another 6 for her father. So he was listening to his mother, and this is one of those weird situations that we have in life. We know that we should honor our father and mother, and yet at the same time, what if your mother tells you to do something that's questionable, right? Do you listen to your mother, honor her, but trick your father, dishonor him, or vice versa? This is where the rubber hits the road, because
There was a lot of jealousy out there because Jacob wanted his father, but he chose Esau, and the mother, Esau, probably felt jealous of him because his mother liked Jacob.
yeah,
A lot of jealousy things.
there's a lot going on. At the same time, let me throw this out to you. You're a parent, and you have 2 children, and you know in your family, for whatever reason, that the oldest son gets something of significant value in your family. Like a piano that's been handed down for generations, a pocket watch, a staff, maybe, I don't know. And you know that, as the parent, that the oldest doesn't care. As soon as he gets it, he's going to pawn it off, right? He's going to, cash out, he's done with it. And you're like, well, I know what the tradition is, right? But I know that the younger one actually would appreciate this, and it would stay in the family. What do? I mean, this is a real life question that, we've dealt with in certain forms. I'm sure we all have, right? Where you have either way, right, something has gone wrong, right? So I know what I do is I don't worry about it. I make the best choice I can and hope that God takes care of it, because he's the only one that can, right? I'm not going to.
Yeah, parents should not show favoritism anyway, and usually the oldest and the baby gets whatever they want. And the ones in the middle, that's usually what happens to some families. Favoritism from the parents.
Well, but that's a modern viewpoint.
That's a modern thing.
That's a modern viewpoint,
That's true.
right? That is not the traditional
No, it's
viewpoint for most of humanity.
Oldest ones that always wish they was the only child because they were spoiled when they were first born.
Mm-hmm.
And then when the last one gets here, all the rest of them spoiled.
We know a lot now. I mean, like, think of all the psychology that's going through our heads right now that we've picked up. I wonder what Dr. Spock says about this, right? right? I mean, we have a lot. In our modern times, we have access to a lot of modern psychology and thought processes and, all this stuff, but when you're out in the middle of the desert with nobody, right? I mean, you don't have these things to think about. If you have an older son who's stronger and faster and tougher, that's a very valuable asset, right, to have, right? So, but I think you're right. I mean, family respect, but at the same time, I mean, you also are your own person too. And how do you balance that? I mean,
As it's gone down through generations, the oldest one was always expected to help look after the younger ones as they come home.
mm-hmm.
They were supposed to protect them, help look after them along with the family.
Yeah. Yeah, and that still happens some today. I mean, we still have Leanna watch our youngest a little bit. I mean, not like a parent, but hey, while I'm in here cooking dinner, can you make sure he doesn't kill himself, right? And I think that's a fair trade-off because we're all getting dinner.
Yeah, and the oldest one's usually the most knowledgeable.
Well, and the oldest one has the most experience too, right? So,
And they're capable of doing it.
and they're capable.
Right.
And, as a family unit, we all work together.
And it teaches them responsibility too.
Mm-hmm. And then, she'll grow up, Leanna, grow up, move on, and then, it kind of works down the pipeline, so to speak. Tori gets to do more. And then Mitchell, these are my children in descending order.
You're teaching them value.
Yeah, I mean, that's what we're trying to do. That way, when they get off on their own, they can, manage an apartment or house or life, hopefully. That's the goal. Man, I need to change this display setting. So that's one lesson. All right, so maybe family respect, maybe how to deal with conflict properly, right? Just because it's in the Bible doesn't mean that that's the way we should do it, okay? Let's remember that. Some people think that it's in the Bible, that's the way we should do it.
Yeah, their culture's different.
No. I mean, sometimes it's in the Bible because it's an example of what not to do, right? Maybe we shouldn't trick our father out of the birthright for our older brother because that's going to cause a lot of problems, right? All right, what's another lesson we can take from this?
As he got older, he was dependable. I mean, once he wanted Rachel, he did work, all those years, and he did grow the flocks and stuff for Laban, and increased his wealth and value.
I'm just bringing up some notes that I took. Yeah, so as you get older, he matured. Jacob changed, right? He went from this immature person to a more mature person and could handle conflict better. Still not perfect, right? But better. Yeah, be careful what you wish for, right? You want 2 wives? Well, you got double the problem, right? I mean, let's think about it. It causes conflict because now you got 2 wives conflicting over, well, who's produced the most children, right? Jealousy. Who knows what the family dynamics between those brothers were? I mean, you're just causing all kinds of problems, not only immediately, but the generations down the line. And we talk about, if we think about Esau being a nation, right? He goes off on his own. Jacob becomes Israel, and his sons are the tribes of Israel. Well, then we've got all kinds of other issues because Edom, the nation that Esau was founded, conflicts with Israel a lot later on. Like there's a generational issues that happen down the line that you read about. Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, all that, right? All the way through Judges, right? We see it. So your impact today, what you choose today can have impacts for many, many generations, centuries, right? And it's hard for us to think of. All because we couldn't just share a bowl of soup. Just saying. Excedrin, coffee. Well, and now we know why drug abuse is so rampant, right?
That's right.
It's a practical application.
Not over here, it's over there.
All right. Any other lessons? Let's see if I can zoom in on this. I cannot. No.
Let me just read it to us.
Yeah, I'm going to read this to you. So the 3 lessons that Anon came up with is idols are always elusive, right? Which is true. I mean, think about, from my perspective, the most common idol in America is money, right? But can you ever have enough money, right? You always want more, right? The more you have, the more you want, right? Very rare do you find somebody who's like, yeah, I've got enough, right? And money has its own problems, because then he's like, oh, I've got a third cousin twice removed, and he's calling me up for a loan. When one idol disappoints us, we often pursue another. It's another lesson that Anon came up with. Romance isn't working out, we turn to, wealth. Wealth isn't working out, we turn to something else, right?
Almost like Anon said that money is a good slave, but it's a terrible master.
Yeah, yeah. And I think that's hard for some of us to realize. Like, you're either in control or you're being controlled, right? There is no, you can't ride the middle. You have to make a choice. Either the money's ruling you or you're ruling your money. And the same thing for everything else. Yeah, you can bring that. And then the last thing is that Anon says is, a sinner like Jacob could never get a hold of idols, but got a hold of God. And one of the things I failed to mention, thank you, dear, is toward the end of his, not the end, I guess middle to end of his life, there's a story in there where Jacob wrestles with a man. He sent his entire party. He's moving, and he's about to meet Esau, and his entire party's moving. They're across the river, and I guess he's left behind, doing last-minute things. And it says that he wrestles a man. A man just appears out of nowhere and wrestles him. And the man asks what's his name, and Jacob's like, who are you? And they wrestle all night, it says. And it says that Jacob would not basically quit. And so the man touched his hip and made him, I guess, pain or hurt or something. And finally, socket. And was unable to, Jacob finally prevailed somehow, or it stopped because of that. And that person was, it says God, or like an incarnation of God. Some people didn't win, right? Does that mean God is weak, right? So in that story, that's when Jacob's name is changed to Israel, right? And it also says that Jacob prevailed. Now, that is the most literal interpretation of God testing you, right? He's physically wrestling with you to see your willpower? What is he testing here? Resolve? I don't know. Yeah. Yeah. So it says he walked with a limp because of that. So all of these idols came to Jacob, and you can't catch them. They're like ghosts, right? You just can't catch them. But yet he physically wrestled with God and prevailed. That's a pretty wild story, right? Because how do you win against God? God lets you, right?
It's the only way.
Yeah, it's the only way, right? But at the same time, if God lets you, what was the purpose there, right? Why would, it's just kind of why. Read the story. It says Jacob just left behind, and then this man comes out and they start wrestling. There's no...
Israel, because you have struggled with God and with humans and have overcome.
Overcome.
But he started the nation of
Well, that's another part of it, right? That changing of Israel creates a country, essentially, a nation. And I think there's another verse past that, and I forget which one, but it talks about,
That's some telling his name.
yeah, the name. There's either the name of the location or something, and it says, because I have seen God's face and survived, or something like that. And which is also pretty amazing, because you remember Moses couldn't see God's face, but we're getting ahead of ourselves. So that's the 3 lessons at Anon. There's many lessons in all of this. So if you have your own, like, it doesn't, just because it's not on this list doesn't mean that it's wrong. There's plenty here to chew on. Now, we kind of talked about this. What is the importance of realizing that when Jacob wrestled with God, Jacob won? Well, we talked about, God let him, obviously. And we talked about some of the purpose, to test his resolve, to test his faith, right? What is he to test? Maybe his motivations? Like, why would... Endurance. I mean, what was he fighting for? I mean, here's a good practical application. World War III is about to start over in Europe, right? We have Russia invading the Ukraine. Russia is a much larger country, has much more military resources country versus Ukraine. And yet, Russia didn't just walk in and stomp all over them. Ukraine is fighting pretty hard. Why? What are they fighting for? Right? Think about it. Think about your motivations. You're a Russian, right? You're just following orders, right? You're drafted, you're in the military. Maybe you love your country, but you're following orders. Ukraine, those people are fighting for their families, their homes, their livelihoods. The motivation, while numerically Russia has much more resources, the motivation, I would argue, is much more on the Ukraine side. They have a lot more to fight for. Now, not to get all political, take that back to the Bible. What is Jacob fighting for?
I believe it comes to a covenant agreement.
A covenant agreement? A new one?
Well, with
The New Testament?
and God had personally, it's never been mentioned. I believe he made something's gonna come to this.
Well,
God honored.
well, God did. I mean, the covenant is there. I would be hesitant to call it a new covenant.
A covenant between the two of them. I don't know if it's new, but if it's ever mentioned or not. I believe they come up with some kind of agreement that Jacob would proceed in his life.
Well, I think it says that in the passage, like, you will go on. And I think God says toward the end, you got to read the whole story, right? I mean, we're picking and choosing. But God says to Jacob, the covenant that I made with your father and his father, right? Abraham and Isaac, right? And now Jacob, will go on.
Maybe he was testing him, because of his wealth and the ones that followed Jacob.
Well, and this was what I was trying to get at. Like, what was he fighting for? Was he fighting just for possessions? Or was he fighting for something bigger? Was he fighting for his group of people? Or was he fighting for what? The blessing? Right? There's a higher level that we're reaching for. Right? What keeps a man moving? Right? This speaks to us today. Like, what keeps us moving? What are we fighting for? Right? Because children grow up, and children can be jerks. I mean, let's be honest. Like, children are a blessing, but man, they can be trying too. Right? What are we fighting for? We're fighting for land, way of life, right? Freedom, right? All these things. But at the same time, if we're going to sum all that up, we're fighting for the hope of God, really. Yeah. Hope of eternal life, a better future, a perfect future, right? Because if we're just going to fight for the same old, right? How many, I don't want another world war for my children, right? I'd rather not. Now I'll fight it if it happens to come on the hope that. So there's a lot of importance with this wrestling with God. And I think if you look back in your own life as a Christian, you could probably see times where you wrestled with God in some form of fashion, right? I can remember when I got saved, the only way I could describe it before I even knew about, knew a lot about the Bible is I wrestled with God because I knew that if I accepted Christ, my life was going to change. At the same time, I knew that I couldn't go on knowing this truth and not change. And it was a wrestle. Like, I remember it. Now, maybe you don't have a physical remembrance of wrestling, but you've had times when you've, I'm sure, wrestled with a decision or a circumstance, right, where God was perhaps testing you, your resolve, right?
We all have those scars.
Yeah. Sometimes, and as hard as it may be, pain is a great teacher. It's unfortunate, but it's true. And think about this. I heard a story of a young girl who had no sensation of pain. It was over in Europe somewhere. And it was terrifying because she had to be really careful because she could stick her hand on like a hot stove, not feel anything, right? And she has scars all over because she'd hit doorways and not feel anything. She'd like slice her leg and not feel anything. Pain has a purpose, right? Now, it is painful though, right? It's not enjoyable, but sometimes we are hard-headed. And let's rephrase that. Most of the time, we are hard-headed.
It reminds you every day what you did to yourself.
Yeah. And that limp that Jacob walked around with, it's a reminder.
Paul had a thorn. Nobody knows what the thorn was.
Yeah. I know what the thorn was. Dealing with other Christians. Man. It's my theory anyway. Yeah, whatever that thorn may have been, some people think it was a stomach issue or something, but I don't think he ever says.
You've had that thorn too, haven't you?
Yeah, I've dealt with it. All right, so what does, this last question, what does Anon say about Genesis 32? I don't know if anybody caught this. Genesis 32 is where Jacob prepares to meet Esau. He's coming back from dealing with Rachel and her father. He's coming back and he's nervous. What does Anon say? Did anybody catch this?
I did not.
So